invited Chuck to come. Svea was very, very happy when he accepted our invitation and said that he could join us. And it's very sad that he isn't here to take care of the lecture, because I think many of the things that Chuck said relate in wonderful ways and are really good here at the Soccer Center. So Professor Perfetti finished his Ph.D. at the University of Illinois, and since, no?
That was my BS.
Oh.
PhD is University of Michigan.
Michigan, okay. I misread your CV.
They both share the blame.
Okay. And since 1967, he's been a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Since 2001, he's been a distinguished university professor of psychology. And since 2008, he's been the director of the Learning Research and Development Center, which is a very unique research center that hosts researchers from psychology, linguistics, education. He has over 100 peer-reviewed publications. He's published 7 books. He's the former president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading. He's a member of all the important scientific associations. And I want to kind of note a few major contributions of his research in our specific context. First of all, I think one of the most impressive things about Chuck's works is how he brings insights from experimental psychology and neuroscience into the educational practice, which I think is something that most of the people here in the room care greatly about. And also he takes the work that arises from basic research into thinking about how we can prevent and ameliorate reading and writing difficulties for children acquiring literacy. And finally, and these are the things he's going to be talking about today, is how reading processes might be different across different languages and different orthographies, and what aspects of reading are universal as opposed to particular. And if David Sher could be here, he would be just sitting and soaking it all up, so we're filming it for him. And finally, what the consequences of these orthographic differences are for learning, and how going from reading in one language system to a different language system might impact processes. So I'm sure it will be fascinating, and thanks again for coming.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I am reminded by your introduction that Svea had invited me here a number of times, and each time there was a reason that I couldn't come. So I was especially eager to come this time, and of course I accepted the invitation via, although poor health was still around. So it's you gotta find it here, although I wish I could hear earlier. Tomorrow's talk, by the way, will be, I think we'll have some relations, closer relations to the work that Svea is most noted for. Today's will be a little different. I want to talk a little bit about work I've done over the years on comparative reading. I'm going to look one more time from my little remote so I can stand up. If I sit too long, my back doesn't like it. So I can stand. The other side might not even work. Because I have a short recently. That's what happens. So I want to begin, and I must say I'm going to cover a wide range of topics because I've done a lot of research of different kinds of comparative reading, from asking how reading is the same and different across different writing systems to how instruction can work for language that's hard to read, at least in English, hard to learn in the English context. But I want to start with a very basic comparative look at visual form. So when you learn to read in a second language, you're at a big advantage if you actually know how to speak the language. And reading in a second language adds, in principle, all it really adds to the language is learning to handle the visual forms and decode them in spoken language. And of course, as we know, forms are different. Is that viewable? It's awfully fuzzy, isn't it? I don't think I have this one as big as it could go. Well, so you can see the, you know, the range, English, Dutch, Spanish, those that are very familiar to English speakers, less familiar down at the bottom, Canada and Khmer and other ones. Not mentioned, David Chair would be here soaking this in. Let me make a slight correction. David Chair would be here jumping on every word I say at this point. He might go along later on. Right here, he would say, what do you know, alphabetic, Hebrew is alphabetic. See what it says up there? Hebrew is alphabetic, consonantal. It often has been called an alphabet without vowels. What David would say is abjad, abjad, abjad. It would be ridiculous. And he'd be right. It's interesting. Hebrew is especially interesting because it is alphabet-like in many ways. And some would even argue that it is fundamentally an alphabet. It has this variation because of the way it inserts distributed letters to represent morphemes and leaves out vowels. But that's not the only dispute. The other was that I had the alpha syllabary up there. It's not really correct, according to many writing scholars, to call Khmer and Kannada and other Indian writing as alphabetic, called alpha syllabary. So with these modern modifications, we have a full set of descriptions to the languages of the world. And having just said we have abjads and alpha syllabary, I have this slide to illustrate that if you classify writing systems based on the levels of linguistic descriptions that the graphs refer to, you can refer to the alphabetic, in which the mapping is graph to phoneme, the syllabic is the graph to syllable, which has historically been called the logographic, which is really the Chinese plus the Japanese kanji system, which is borrowed from the Chinese. Those are the logographic systems in which a graph maps to a morpheme in the language, or sometimes to a whole word, to the extent single characters stand as words. So the abjads and the alpha syllabaries would need to be added in there to make the system complete, but for the purposes of sort of broad contrast, I represent each of these with the graphs you see. The alphabet, the graph to phoneme. In English speakers are used to seeing alphabets represented by English or Spanish or some well-known European language, but the example there at the very top that I'd like to point out is Korean. So even though the graphs are not using either the familiar Roman alphabet or the Cyrillic alphabet, Korean, which sort of borrowed segments that are consistent with Chinese in some ways, each of those graphs refers to a phoneme. So Korean is alphabetic. The Japanese kana system is on the right, that's the syllabic one, and Chinese represents the logographic system. I like to think of a very simple diagram that captures the problem with presentation tools is that I look at the slide ahead, so I might have been talking the slide ahead. Is that true? Is what I just said relevant for this? So when I was saying what you see on the left there, you weren't actually seeing that. Now you see. So the top is Korean, the kana, the Japanese kana is the second, and the Chinese is the third. This graph illustrates, I think, a kind of a general way of thinking about these systems, the relation between the writing system and the language. And I think, especially when it comes to learning to read, it's fundamental to understand that real success depends upon knowing the language. If you don't know the language, the reading is going to be highly constrained, highly superficial. You want to think about these writing systems, that I've been describing as defined by the level of a principle. That is, a principle is, what is it in the language system that the graph connects to? Does it connect to the phoneme? Does it connect to the syllable? Does it connect to the morpheme? Or does it have some multiple connections? People talk a lot about orthography, and I would like to define the orthographic system at a somewhat lower level. The orthographic system is a way to implement the broad principle of the writing system. So even an alphabetic system gets implemented in more than one way. English has a very, sometimes called a deep orthography, because the letters don't faithfully map one-to-one to phoneme. So English implements the alphabetic principle in a way that's slightly different from, say, Finnish or Welsh or Spanish or Italian, which map those letters very faithfully to the phonemes. So orthographic system implements the principles of a writing system by mapping graphic units onto some unit of a language. You can map it onto, morphemes, phonemes, syllables, and all the options that you see on the right. I want to go in a little bit of detail in the Chinese case. Okay. Is it hard to hear me? Oh, okay. I thought. Well, I will stand a little more, and that will cause my voice to be better. I am probably trying to save my voice. I warned it not that I had come up with a laryngitis a couple days ago, but I think so. Can you hear me now? Can I continue to talk, or do you really want to wire me up?
I just don't want you to.
Okay. I think you're right. If I project without speaking loud enough.
And you can feel like a rock.
I can feel it. Okay. Okay. So I do want to spend a little time on comparative studies for Chinese. I wish for all of us I had done more comparative work on Hebrew and English. On the other hand, I didn't. And but I'll tell you why I started with Chinese. I worked on reading in English for quite some time, and actually a graduate student came from China, and I got interested in the fact that Chinese worked very differently from English. I thought all the things that I was studying about reading in English, was I just studying reading in English, or was I studying reading? And you can't answer that question unless you have some sense of what it's like to read in other writing systems and other orthographies. And it turns out that English is a very high contrasting case. It's high contrasting to Hebrew as well, and it's certainly high contrasting to any alphabetic system in which the mappings go from letters to grapheme. So this is a familiar Chinese character. The question is, how different is a reading process that's able to read this Chinese character compared with one that's able to read English, compared with one that's able to read Hebrew? And we don't start with the idea that they're all, the processes are all the same, nor should we assume they're all different until we get a better idea of things. I want to point out something that in Chinese that's actually also true of the writing systems that developed in this part of the world. That is a movement from relatively concrete to relatively abstract graphs over time. So the pictographic content for horse, which is clearly visible here, has pretty much disappeared. This actually disappeared very early. So things became very much more abstract. And a similar tendency occurs in, as I said, in the systems that developed in the Middle East. That allows us to get away from the idea when we study Chinese of thinking about pictographs. So the difference in reading Chinese and reading English or some other system is not that Chinese gives you pictures. It's got to do with the fact that the graph does not map onto a small unit of sound in the language, but to a morpheme that has meaning. This is a model, well, this is a representation of a fact that we try to explain in a model that we developed to compare Chinese and English reading. The thing to notice here is the three components of a word. We have it in terms of system here, so the orthographic system, the phonological system, and the meaning system. And what to notice here is that we're talking about a single syllable. I don't represent the tone here. A single syllable with a very specific tone. Chinese is tonal, so in addition to phoneme segments, you got in Mandarin you have four tones plus a bass tone. In Cantonese you have more. But there's a number of characters, and all of these characters have this pronunciation. So they all map to the very same syllable, but they all have distinct meanings. So we have this one-to-many mapping from phonology to orthography, and this many-to-many mapping from orthography to meaning. The implication of that, of course, is that it would be a pretty inefficient system for this to be truly syllabic. Because in a syllabary, in a syllabic system, each of those graphs will map onto a syllable in the language. But that's not what Chinese does, and that's graph illustrates why it is that way. This fact of Chinese has allowed people to do experiments, and when we began, the main question was, when you read Chinese, do you, does the mind evoke the sound that's associated with the character, the syllable? Because it was widely believed that Chinese, that was not true of Chinese. It was even said in English reading pedagogy by Frank Smith. Frank Smith said, the goal, this is a slight paraphrase because I forgot the exact words, but it's pretty close. The goal in English reading is to be able to read English the way that Chinese read Chinese. What he meant by that is that you ought to be able to read strictly visually, going from the visual representation to the meaning. In other words, in that diagram that I just showed, you'd go from the orthography to the meaning very directly. And that was widely accepted. I was willing to buy that, but I also felt that language was kind of fundamental here, and if you could speak the language, that somehow the graphs, if you're really getting into the linguistic system, even though your goal is to get the meaning, and even though that's what you do get, that somehow the sounds of the language, the syllables would be involved. So we started doing experiments because of this nature of Chinese in which we could separate sound from orthography. So here are two words with the first tone, jing. The one that means frightened has this graph, the one that means crystal has this, and you can see there's absolutely no overlap in the visual forms of the graphs. And Q with the fourth tone is another example of that. So we can do experiments in which we would show these two to the subject and say, just press the button and say yes if they have the same meaning, and say no if they don't. And in addition to these, where the sound is the same, of course, we have pairs of characters in which the sound was different, so we could do a comparison and find that we had a pretty big effect. If the two graphs had the same sound and the subjects had to say that they did not have the same meaning, they would eventually arrive to the right conclusion we did not have the same meaning. But it would take quite a bit longer for them to reach that decision compared to controls where there was no similarity in sound. And of course you don't want to really compare it with the case where they had to say yes. The real comparison is here. And we've had lots of studies that show the same result, and it led to a pretty compelling conclusion that when you read Chinese characters, if you're a native Chinese speaker, the the syllable sound that corresponds to the character gets activated. I sometimes point out this other study we did because everyone knows about the Stroop task, right? Now, if you know about it, and you know that even though you know about it, if you were a subject, you would still show the effect. It's pretty powerful. So this is written in English, and you can do this experiment in any language. If you happen not to know English and you did this experiment, you wouldn't find naming these colors pretty, you wouldn't find it hard. You would say, red, blue, green, so, and it takes, if you know English, you stumble, you're going to make errors, so it takes a long time. But this allowed us to do such an experiment in Chinese and exploit this wonderful fact about Chinese, that sound and meaning are dissociated. So here on the left is the color character, top left there is the color character Hong, which means red. So you could print it in red ink, which would be congruent, or you could be nasty and print it in blue ink, which is not congruent. And of course, in the Stroop task, the subject would be asked, just name the color, ignore anything else about it, just name the color. That would be just like the English task. Here's the homophone case, though, the very same syllable, hong, with a, that means here broad, and again, you can put it in red and blue. Here's one where you just change the tone. You change it from the second to the first tone. It means bomb. And here's an interesting one. It means blood. It doesn't have any sound correspondence to hong. It's just that it connotes the red color. You could do that for red and blue, and then of course you have control. Well, all I want to say about that is, I just had little things here to show you what I was talking about when we did that. So there is the question there was whether you get these homophone effects. Stop going. We were especially interested, we were pretty sure we'd get it up here, right? If you didn't get it up here, you wouldn't be getting Stroop. Would you get it here, where it's a completely different meaning? Would you get it here, it's a completely different sound, but the meaning's related? And I don't think I have the data graph here. This paper is published in Cognition some time ago. The data could be seen if you wanted to, but I'm just telling you what happened. Interference here, interference here, interference here, a little bit here. So in the Stroop task, if you try to ignore any property of the color, either its meaning or its sound, you're unable to do so. You get phonology interference. That's the main point in the present context. Which is another example that when you read Chinese, just as if you're reading English, and by the way, in Hebrew too, it's complex in Hebrew. Ron Frost, I didn't do much in Hebrew, but Ron Frost and I, some years ago, collaborated on a study that seemed to imply that when you read Hebrew, you get these kind of effects from different paradigms. So the point is, the spoken forms of words are activated even when you read a writing system that does not require. So again, the logic of Chinese does not require phonology, but the mechanics, the cognitive processes of reading apparently do, provided you know the native language. Right? Second languages works as well. I shouldn't assume. So phonology is part of reading universally because writing encodes spoken language. I made some broad generalizations from studies. There's an old, in anthropology, you can say that if you have two cultures that have the same thing, you can claim a generalization. If you have three, you can claim a universal. So had English and Chinese, and I wanted to claim a universal. So I wanted to claim essentially that phonology is universal across writing systems in the following sense. You will observe phonology in a language at the level in which the graphs encode the phoneme. You won't always get at the phoneme level, sometimes we get at the syllable level. But we also, as we looked, did more research, we began to see clearly that there's, within this universal phonology, there were systematic variabilities. Also, by the way, I got this faded because I'm not going to talk about it today. One of the important things about doing comparative research is that it raises new issues. The kinds of things that people are studying today are quite a bit different from the days in which in the United States and it was only English was being studied. And then after that, only European languages. Not they were only being studied, but that in terms of the dominance in the literature, the questions people ask, this is David Sharon made, so at this point David would be nodding. The questions people ask are constrained by the language they're studying. And unless you go across languages, you keep studying the same things over and over in minute detail, and sometimes you miss new questions. So I mentioned that there were systematic differences, so I want to point out what I meant by that. There is the universal, and then there's this. Writing systems control the details of how the phonology and meaning are obtained from the graphic form. So here's a study that we did in English showing the time course of graphic and phonological information in a priming study. I don't want to go into the details of the studies unless I'll save it for later if anyone has questions. These are published studies, and this one's a pretty old one. But the basic point is that this yellow graph, which shows phonological effects, and this red one, which shows visual graphic effects, have congruent time courses. In other words, phonology gets started a little bit late, a little bit later. So and goes on, but they're together. The idea in an alphabetic system is that the phonology and the orthography work together in a cascade style. This is a term that Max Coulthard used to describe alphabetic reading. Cascade in the following sense. You can see some of the letters of a word in milliseconds, and they start pushing on phonology because they have mappings to phonemes. And then that cascades to more identification with the letters and so on, and they go on in the same cycle. Another thing that seems to be true in English is that you can, especially for lower frequency words you might not be familiar with, the orthography will activate the sounds of the word, and then you use that to get to meaning. So this idea of mediation can happen quite robustly in alphabetic. Chinese, it's quite different. In experiments that were different from this one. This is not an ideal comparison. These were slightly different paradigms, but other paradigms tend to show similar things. We found this in the case of Chinese. Graphic information was available quickly. This is milliseconds here. So within 50 milliseconds, 43 to 57, we see a rise in priming due to having the same visual form in the prime as the target. It's as if you get a head start on what the thing looks like, and that helps you identify. Phonology, I'm sorry, I don't know if I was pointing to the yellow, but I should have been pointing to the red for the graphic. Right up here between 43. It's immediately high, and then it drops. And just as it drops, the phonology rises. So now, what I mean by phonology rises, I'm showing you a prime character that has no visual overlap with what you're going to see next, but it has a similar pronunciation, and that seems to help get a head start on identification. So a great thing to see just how different these graphs are. If this is cascade, this is threshold style. What that means is that the rise of phonology happens only with the fall of the graphic component. And to put it even more simply, it's only as you recognize the character that its sound is available. In an alphabetic language, parts of the sounds are available, parts of the sounds of the words are available before you identify the word. That's the simplest way to put this kind of complicated comparison. Threshold, first you have to identify the character, then you get the sound as you identify the character. So there's some differences. So, two universal principles. The language constraint, I haven't emphasized that because it's obvious, but it's worth mentioning that all writing systems in current use are not about meaning. They all map language in some way or another. It's relevant to this progression I showed you in Chinese from being more pictographic to less pictographic. And the universal phonological principle that all writing systems engage phonology as the smallest unit available in the system. So this is where we were in my lab when we started to do brain studies. So we've done quite a bit of behavioral studies in the way of comparison, and we started getting interested in whether the differences we observe behaviorally have any correspondence in the neural systems that support reading. And this is my only Hebrew example, but I wanted to increase the generalization. So, this is also one of the few times I'm citing someone else's work, but this may be familiar to you. The Baker et al. In 2007 had readers in native Hebrew speakers and English speakers respond to various kinds of stimuli, words, these are called false fuzz digits, English words, Hebrew words, letter strings. The graph is simple. You don't have to worry about all the colors. The main thing is that Hebrew readers, I haven't told you what this is about. This is what's being measured here. This is measures of bold signal change in the visual word form area. You probably know, so I won't spend much time with just to mention the visual word form area is a piece of occipital temporal cortex that is especially active in humans when they are being exposed to print, and it's more active for words than letter strings. So the idea was that it's a piece of neural tissue that is, exactly why this is the case is interesting and complex, but for some reason that piece of neural tissue is especially useful for reading and very much experience-based in the sense that it tunes itself to the language that you're reading. And this comparison, and why this comparison is important is because it gives evidence for that assumption. Hebrew readers are most sensitive to Hebrew in that area, the visual word form area responds most to Hebrew, and English readers responds most to English. So the importance of that is it shows that this area, whatever it's the privileged area for reading, it gets to be that way because of the experience it has with a particular visual stimulus and in particular the forms that the writing system uses. When we turn to Chinese, which is where we were doing our work, a postdoc of mine at the time, Lehigh Tan, and this is a graph that he later published doing essentially a meta-analysis. But these are both meta-analyses. We did one in Pittsburgh, they did one China using some studies that weren't actually the same. Those across a lot of studies. What seemed to be found is the gray areas are a very simplified illustration of areas that are involved in reading English. It's not exhaustive, and a lot of details are missing. There's a lot more going on in this area, and angular gyrus is not represented. But these three areas, here's what the visual word form area is. Temporal parietal areas seem to be involved in alphabetic reading with phonology. Inferior frontal does as well, kind of a ventral and dorsal pathway to the inferior frontal cortex where language functions are, among other things, are important. But in the Chinese, what we were finding is that in addition to having brain activation areas here, there's a very strong activation in the corresponding point on the right hemisphere, occipital-temporal area, basically a homologue to this area. More active in Chinese than in English. There was also a superior parietal area that was active more than this temporal parietal area. And instead of the inferior frontal area, the frontal area that was most active in Chinese was the middle frontal gyrus. And these findings occurred over and over again, enough to make one say that while the two systems involve some similar some of the same brain regions, they also seem to involve some different brain regions. We did a learning study in which we taught English speakers Chinese in a very primitive way. We did not teach them the Chinese language. We taught them to read in Chinese, a vocabulary of I don't know how many, about 60 to 100 in there somewhere. New characters where they would learn to pronounce them, and we learn the English translation. And then we put them in the scanner and asked whether they were showing any brain areas that were similar to what we had observed. And this is what we found, is that even after, well, I just realized we did two studies. I described one study, what I'm showing you is a different one. Let me go back a little bit on this one. This one is a better, even more significant study because we studied English learners who had a year of classroom learning of Chinese. This is better for the point I want to make anyway. We got some of these results with people exposed to for only a couple of weeks, but these people, after all, were trying to learn Chinese. They were in classrooms voluntarily. Nobody made them study Chinese at the University of Pittsburgh. But within a year, when we did scans on them, we found a lot of this very same pattern that I just showed you for native Chinese. This told us that those areas that are distinctive for Chinese are areas that are going to get involved as you learn to read Chinese, even if you learn to read it as a second language. This led us to suggest the following general idea. We also did some comparisons with Chinese learners of English to make this make sense. There are two ways of the brain reacting to a new language. One way is that it can try to use what it has been trained on in its first language to essentially assimilate aspects of the second language into those procedures. Extending the reading procedures with L1 to L2. Now that's not to say, that's just, if you think about it, that seems kind of natural. You get something new to do, you use what you know how to do to try to do it. And so it's kind of a default system. Assimilation is the default way of handling a new task. The combination, these are words, these should sound familiar to you. Piaget used these words to describe children's cognitive development in an interesting way. The combination idea is that In order to learn the second language, if it's as highly contrasting as Chinese and English, if it's across one of these writing systems, from alphabetic to logographic in this case, that the brain actually has to make an accommodation to acquire new procedures to read the second language. Assimilation is the default. Accommodation is what we've observed when English readers learn Chinese. Different brain subnetworks get activated to handle the distinctive properties of the writing system. One of these distinctive properties is spatial detail. We, of course, wondered, especially as of others, why the right hemisphere, posterior right hemisphere visual areas are more involved in Chinese. One idea is this, that to learn Chinese, you have to have coarse-grained spatial relations. You know, to learn English or Hebrew, you have to have fine grains. In English, think of the difference between, say, E, a small e and a small c, or a D and a B. Those are relatively fine-grained spatial distinctions. These are more coarse-grained. If you take this radical and this radical, they can be combined this way and this way. You can even put one inside the other. So these are three different spatial relations. Each of those relations has a different meaning in Chinese. So if you're going to learn to read Chinese, you learn to handle these broad spatial relations. There's another example that involves three characters that have different spatial relations. That, by hypothesis, is one of the reasons we get more right hemisphere than left hemisphere. We found this very same pattern for both English learners of Chinese and native speakers of Chinese, in which we get left hemisphere followed by right hemisphere. But these are things you can do with ERPs, fine-grained data in terms of time. Less than 50 milliseconds. 50 milliseconds later, we get right hemisphere kick in. So it's interesting, actually, that in Chinese, left hemisphere is involved sooner, as if the details of the character are being processed immediately. Spatial relations, perhaps, just a little bit later. I'm going to skip the details on this. This is an MEG. We also did an MEG study which found the very same thing, which gives me great confidence, increased confidence that this is the right story, that left hemisphere followed quickly by right hemisphere activity in reading Chinese. Here's a recent graph we put together based on research. A lot of the research that's behind this graph was done by James Booth and Fan Chao, who was a postdoc with me. And it has some generalities for across language. It's not just about Chinese. I think it's possibly quite general. We plotted, based on data available, where we think development goes. So imagine a child reading Chinese, a child reading English at age 6, 7, and developmentally forward. And based on where one sees activation in fMRI studies during reading, we see this pattern that I'm showing you. So in both Chinese and English developmentally, you get an increase in the fusiform gyrus. That's the visual word form error. So in other words, the basic word identification skill that happens at either the radical level in Chinese or the letter string level in English. And one can hypothesize that developmentally, having this area more kick in and do more work, that's a developmental universal. But then down here, there's a couple more. Orthographic phonological mapping. But let me point just to the differences for a moment. What we think we see the right visual orthographic areas in reading English. Children also have right visual orthographic areas, but they decrease with development, whereas in Chinese they increase. Sublexical phonology, which is often identified with the superiotemporal gyrus, is the opposite pattern. Chinese readers at an early age are showing this phonological area active, and it decreases with time, whereas with English, it increases. Both systems, though, have to integrate phonology and orthography. Remember, it's the idea of the universal is that just a question of what's the level linguistically that gets integrated. So we see increases for both the Chinese and English for for the left inferior parietal lobule, which seems to be identified with orthographic phonological mapping in a way that is more or less independent of the unit size, unlike unlike this area. So this area is sensitive to the unit. This area seems to be more about the fact that there's an integration occurring. Similarly, the left middle frontal gyrus, which is strongly identified with Chinese, as more research has been done, we find this area getting more involved in reading English as well. One possibility for what this area, the left middle frontal gyrus, is doing is that it helps you attend to the critical parts of the word that you're reading. So in Chinese, there's a lot of control needed in making sure that the character you're looking at is, especially if pronunciation is getting activated, it's not the one that means this, it's the one that means that, if the phonology is interfering. That's a bit of a speculation, but that's one possibility. Okay. Let me end with, this isn't the real end, this is the fake end. The people say they make you think it's almost over, and then after that they do something else. So Chinese is hard to read, hard to learn for English speakers. I'll point out the State Department in the United States that trains diplomats, and well, actually, that's the main thing it does in this language. The Defense Department uses these kinds of things as well to help people learn a language that might be relevant for their diplomatic careers. So this is the hours it takes to learn. And this, what I like about this graph is this is empirically demonstrated by people who want to save money. They don't want to give you more hours than they think you need, or they want to give you enough that you don't fumble your job. So, Danish, Dutch, Norwegian. Let's see, is Hebrew's in here in the middle, category 2, along with Albanian and Slovak and Ukrainian. I might, from personal circumstance, disagree. Mandarin, Cantonese, two Chinese languages, Japanese. They're tough and they give a lot of marks. That's just a way of demonstrating why trying to understand how to have better instruction in this is worth doing. If you can be more efficient in learning it. And it's hard. And of course, we all know that if you want to learn a second language, sitting in a college classroom for a couple of years is maybe not the best way to do it. On the other hand, we teach, if we do it that way, if you really want to get proficient, you get some level of immersion and find a way to do more than you do in the classroom. Yet we expect some learning from classrooms. So the question, the practical question is sort of how to make it better. So we already can see the struggles that one would have. Chinese characters present unfamiliar forms. And I'm talking only about reading again. I've come away from the language altogether, which is a whole other story. The forms are unfamiliar. The way those forms connect to the language you're trying to learn, those are different. You've got to learn either the simplified character, you would learn this, and you're learning the traditional characters as are used in Taiwan and Hong Kong, you use the far left one. And the fact is that it's pretty character at a time learning, even in native Chinese speakers. There's some productivity in the system, a little bit, because of radicals being combined to form characters, and some of those radicals give you a clue to the pronunciation. Those are called phonetics. Some give you clues to the meanings, semantic radicals. It's a very incomplete set of cues, and so the learning really does seem to happen character by character. We've done a lot of studies we've learned a lot about the time course of learning Chinese in college classrooms. For example, we've learned that one of the last things you learn is pronunciation, and that's because there's not enough language, enough oral language in the instruction. We've learned that semantics comes first, as if you're learning sort of translation instead of learning the language. A lot of things like that are background for this. And I didn't, for time purposes, I want to focus just on one thing that I think is especially interesting. And that is the idea that learning to write characters can support learning to read characters. This is something we've discovered in behavioral studies, in fMRI studies, and in ERP studies. So we can give a little flavor of that. So here's the tutorial system we developed. Subject, these are learners. They're in Chinese classrooms. We bring them out and teach them characters that are not in their book yet, or from the following year. So they don't know them, but they're motivated to learn them. So they, in the condition in which we have people write, they see this one, they then hear its pronunciation, they see an English translation, and then all that goes away, and they're to write it from memory. We compare that with the control condition that has equal time on just reading. In some of our experiments, there are other conditions, like they would type pinyin, which is the alphabetic rendering of Chinese, so you could type the syllable of shi by typing in SHI in the tone. We've had then, most important control, I think, is where we had them actually write with their hands, pen and paper, to write the pinyin, to write the letter. Because what we think might be important is being able to write might set up a sensory motor component to the reading method. So just a quick look. Here's the basic phenomenon in the behavioral study. So if this is behavioral results based on what I just showed you with that kind of computer tutor, comparing the condition where you had access to the character for an equal amount of time with one where you wrote it. Now this is later. This is a week later. You come into the lab, and we simply give you the character, and you have to do a lexical decision. We did other tests as well, but in other words, is it a character or not? And it's just a really big effect if you would have writing on that character. So the conclusion is that writing supports reading in this sense. This shows that the pinyin writing, even though you're moving your hands, you got the motor component, but it's not tied to the visual representation. So it's motoric, but it's not sensory motoric, it's not visual motoric. So why does writing help recognition? There are a couple of possibilities, at least. One is not the one I originally favored, but I knew it was a good possibility. When you write in this task as I described it to you, it will cause you to direct visual attention to the character. When that character first comes up, if you know you have to write it, you just pay more attention to it. And maybe that's all there is to it. That would enhance the quality of a visual orthographic representation, but it wouldn't necessarily mean that you've got a visual motor component. But the original hypothesis was that writing adds additional sensory motor coding to the orthographic representation system, so that in a fairly literal sense, the reading network, which has visual orthography and meaning and phonology and adds some subsystems that are involved in motor movement. And if that's the case, then we would expect effects, neural correlates of writing instruction to show up in visual spatial areas, motor areas. Meaning areas question mark, that's because in our behavioral studies we found that writing had a stronger effect on orthography to meaning connections than anything else. That is, when we gave you a character and asked you what it meant, you were especially good if you had writing experience. And I think that's just the relative ease for a learner to associate a meaning with something than to associate a pronunciation, even when they're trying to learn the language. It's also possible that writing may actually strengthen the pathway from orthography to semantics. That would be, if you go back to one of the diagrams I showed earlier, actually one of the ways Chinese can be read by going orthography to semantics. So here's an instructional study I'm going to tell you about. We compared reading plus writing, reading plus opinion, writing, reading only, and trained people learned these characters, then we tested the learned characters. We also created some novel characters and put them in the fMRI situation in the scanner. They made lexical decisions. They also just laid back and watched, but viewed characters. And we had them do an imaginary writing task too. We asked them when they see the character to imagine writing it. And the question in each case was, what did the brain activation patterns look like as a function of what condition they were in earlier? Did they learn to read these characters by writing or by reading only? And this is the training procedure that's similar to what I showed you before when I showed you the tutor. This is just a and here's what we found based on the fMRI study, that there were indeed some brain areas that were more active during reading characters that were learned with character writing, and they're shown here with these arrows. What I did, I just put the diagram I showed you before about when I showed you that learners of Chinese show these areas, as well as native speakers of Chinese. The arrows point to the conclusion that writing strengthened visual word form area recognition, also strengthened the right hemisphere area, which is distinctive for Chinese, also strengthened the superior parietal area, which is characteristic of Chinese. Most interesting, also motor and premotor cortex, and the left middle temporal gyrus, which is associated with meaning. So all of those areas showed more activation when you looked at a character that you had learned to write, and if you looked at a character that you had learned to recognize, but not through writing. So the writing effects are associated with visual, spatial, orthographic, and sensory motor areas. And I'm not going to show you all here's a representative slide. So what I really want to show in this graph is this interesting relation. This shows the right middle frontal gyrus, that's the right side, and I showed you the superior parietal lobule, and left sensory motor cortex. And what these graphs are showing is a correlation between the degree of activation in those areas and the accuracy in lexical decision. So basically, more activation in these brain areas that are distinctive, that have been distinctively brought about by writing, are associated with better reading. So it's pretty reasonable evidence to suggest that yes, you are increasing some brain activation areas, including areas associated with sensory motor activity, and this is what's producing the effect. This is a summary of what I just said. The activation in these areas predict recognition accuracy. I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to say one word. We've also done this with ERPs. Another training study. This time we measured people with with ERPs, because we wanted to see what the time course of things were like, in particular whether we could see evidence that the recognition component in the ERP was affected. And I'll just show this slide to show what we found. Surprisingly, we found a 100 millisecond effect that seems to be the P100 is associated with visual attention. This is surprising. What I'm saying here is that if you learn to write the character, then later on, this is a week later, 2 weeks, maybe did it twice, 2 weeks later, and then 4 weeks later, it's as if there's a stronger visual attention when you see it. It's like, to put it loosely, this is the character I learned to write, but it's so rapid, it's actually hard to explain. Probably should be replicated, but it's interesting as well. But we also found the N170 is left posterior, which is associated with recognition. Again, this is evidence of stronger orthographic recognition because you've done writing. And you also find a greater P600, which can be interpreted as an episodic memory for the learned characters. That as you see this character, and you can actually retrieve the episode of learning associated with it. At least that's an interpretation. I want to get closer to concluding here, so I'm going to skip a little bit. I do want to point out that we wondered about, do you really have to do the writing? There are other ways of drawing visual attention. So we were playing with animation. Wendy Cheng has included some animation studies in which the subject watches the character being written instead of having to write it itself. It's not clear whether that's any worse. We haven't had the direct comparison in imaging study, and we're not quite sure what to conclude about how effective it is. But it would be important to find out, because this is much easier than having to write. It's also a good way of learning the composition of the character. So let me just summarize. The brain's reading network emerges with experience in reading. It does have components that are shared across languages and writing system, but experience also brings in more specialized components that accommodate the demands of the writing system and the language that the writing system encodes. This is important. I think instruction is not all the same. Instruction affects specific components of the reading network. What you focus on is what you're going to get. You can get more orthographic learning, you get more phonological learning, different components. Learning of Chinese is a challenge. It can be supported by writing other, there's a nice little misspell, orthographic. Speaking of orthographic, what word did misspell? Orthographic enhancement procedures. Attention to orthographic forms supports the visual spatial memory. Perhaps sensory components are added to the reading network, and we get long-term effects for learning reading by orthographic recognition. Okay. I'm going to, I said that was a fake conclusion. This next one is an appeal. This is an appeal for participants. So anybody, I'm going to wind up asking you if you have any, happen to have any friends who speak Hebrew. Or any students who speak Hebrew. That is a very interesting project by my graduate student, Mary Cheng, for her dissertation. Our lab has done a lot on comparative reading. We tended to emphasize the things I've been talking about. Wendy's very interested in the question of how come the graphs look different across all these systems. Not so much how come, because that's lost in the sands of time and the development of these orthographies, but what are the consequences of having more graphs in your language or fewer graphs in your language, or having more complex graphs or relatively simple graphs? And she is studying 129 languages, a few of these in the laboratory. She's developed measures of complexity, 60 alphabetic, I didn't even know there were 60 algebra languages. one for morphosyllabary, you know which one that is now, that's Chinese. We tend to call it syllabary. It's a loner. And he wants to find out about complexity. So how do you measure visual complexity? Parametric complexity has been proposed, and it's pretty interesting. It's basically the ratio of the perimeter of a visual object over its area, 4 pi times its area size. I just want to give you a general flavor of this. Don't worry about the math, because here is the intuition you'll have. A circle has a ratio of 1. It's its perimeter over 4 times its diameter is 1. One can assume that this is the basis of creating that formula, that the assumption is that the simplest figure you can have is a circle, such that even a square is more complex. A square is 1.27 because its perimeter is not quite a ratio of 1 to its to 4 pi times its area, and a square times a square is even more. This is just one way of showing you that there is a kind of measure of parametric complexity. You can apply it to any kind of object. So this cat is less complex than this horse, and that in turn is less complex than this figures. All by this measure of basically the ratio of the perimeter of a visual figure to its area. And that correlates with some interesting things. Wendy, in her dissertation, has added some other measures that she thinks are important, and she's already done all of the work to show that she's correct. She's just showing some other things that are not complexity. She, for example, adds disconnected components. So Chinese has, put them in color, there are all these disconnected components. The assumption is that that's an element of complexity, and she's done some correlations to show that. Connected points, how many connected points do you have? All those little yellow dots, so where if you were using a pen, it'd just be where you'd have to either turn your pen or left it up, all these elbows. So that's another one, which is come up with a number of simple features. Generalized alpha transformation, if you know what that is. And visualizing the results. I'm going to skip all of this. What I hope I've done is convince you that this is interesting. I do want to actually point out what she's mainly interested in. So, as a function of what your reading experience is, how you approach visual symbols, she's already demonstrated that the complexity comes from the number of graphs you need. As your system requires more graphs, it has no choice but to increase complexity. You can only use so many circles and squares, right? And then you start getting fancy. So number of graphs drives complexity. What drives the number of graphs? Well, alpha syllabaries tend to have a lot of graphs. Nothing comes close to Chinese. Chinese is the outlier. Some alphabets have more than others as a function of how faithful their mapping is. So this is what she's interested in. And she's done some laboratory studies. Here's her aim. So, but the grapheme perception is constrained by the human visual system, in which case it doesn't matter what your background is. When you view the stimuli that she would show her subjects, it wouldn't matter. Or that the learning experiences have tuned grapheme perception to the visual attributes of the first language. So she's done all of this, and now she needs subjects. what she did, I didn't explain this, but she had a kind of interesting procedure in which she's identified the centroid in multidimensional analysis. She's identified the centroid within a system. It turns out that the centroid being the distance between this language and all the other languages that share, say, an alphabet, all the other languages that share, say, a syllabary. So in the case of syllabary, the centroid is Cree. There's a good chance you've never heard of Cree. It's an indigenous North American language. It's too bad for her sake that the centroid wasn't, well, actually all true syllabaries are either extinct or they're shared, as in the case of Japanese with the kanji, some other system. So, yeah, quite a few of the indigenous languages in America are Cree. She's having trouble with Cree, and we're trying to make a change there. But why should she have trouble with Hebrew, which turns out to be the centroid of the alphabets? But she is. She's doing this by mechanical Turk. Anybody know what mechanical Turk is? It's a way of an Amazon platform for participating in surveys, experiments, all kinds of things for pay. And she's, she did an IRB, which is getting your institution in the United States to approve of your procedures at a certain rate. And it turns out, well, that rate is fine for some parts of the world. It's a little too low for Israel. And so here are the languages. There's Hebrew in the central. There's pretty Chinese. Urdu in the center of Alpha Slavic Russian. So here's the thing. She has a. There's a help sign. If you have any contacts, I think I have her email in the next slide. And we know they're going to be bilingual. This is, I caution you, that's the problem. I mean, I'm not sure this is ideal. They're very good. We don't. She doesn't have to have Hebrew speakers who are only Hebrew and not bilingual. Wait a minute. Where's the email? Oh no. All right. All right. Let's see if I put it there somewhere else. A lot of slides I don't need. Okay, so let me wrap up. I will. I think after I stop talking, while you see if you, I guess we got time and nobody interrupted me during my talk, so I will accept some questions now. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to try to find Wendy's email. There's actually, we have a board where we could write it on. You can tell it to me. I can write it over here. I need a marker.
I'll go get a marker.
L-I-C
72 at Pitt.edu.
Yeah, no, what I could remember. There's also a server, so that you no longer have to go through Amazon. Sure. If someone sends her an email, she will send them the address of a server, and she'll figure out some way to pay people They have to be Hebrew speakers. She's found a few people who don't pass her little test that she does, like translating some words. There's some people who will, they enjoy Amazon Turk and do that. So, but this way you don't have to go through Amazon Turk. You get direct connection to the server, and the subject could do that. So if anybody wants to help Wendy's very interesting research project, copy down that email and send her one. So thank you very much.
Do you have time for a few questions?
The right temporal area for Chinese, it's exactly the equivalent of the visual waveform area in the left side or not?
It's close within.
In terms of coordinates.
I understand. In terms of coordinates, it's not identical, but it's close within a few millimeters. It's close enough, but it's not exact. You're right. It's not exact. I can look them up later. It's not exact. And when I said a few millimeters, I'm not sure how many I should say there, but it could be a centimeter maybe. So that's probably a good point. You do get this area in other languages as well. Sometimes you get it in English, and sometimes it looks like you get it when you're learning. So when you're learning, even English kids show this area. There's a lot of visual work going on, and you can imagine that at early stages everybody's getting it. But this area stays with Chinese at high levels of skill.
Because in some instances we see bilateral activation still with a left dominance, and I'm wondering whether it's something that is really related to expertise and.
It could. That is another possibility. Although I think. Let me be clear about one thing. The left area, in some sense, is dominant. The bold signal will be stronger there, and as I said before, actually, with MEG and ERP, you get evidence that it comes on earlier. So I think it's fair to say that Chinese is also left dominant. I don't want to imply the opposite. It's that there's something else going on in the right hemisphere that's not going on as much in other languages. I have no reason to assume that the Chinese speakers we've studied are less expert in Chinese than our English speakers are in English, but we don't find the developmental data that James Booth and Fan Chao have suggest that that area is gets stronger over childhood between early grades and I think 5th to 8th grade, I think was their span. So that may be consistent with its the value it has for Chinese reading. It becomes more specialized.
I have one more question here. We spoke about the P100, the N170, and the P600. You were speaking about enhancement or reduction after learning.
See, P100 more positive after learning. N170 was more negative after learning, and the P600 was more positive after learning. The P600 did not last long. We tested them after a week and after 4 weeks. And while it was present after 1 week, after 4 weeks, it wasn't, which is consistent with the idea that after 4 weeks, the circumstances of the learning were no longer part of the system. But the strong orthographic learning that was associated with writing was still there after 4 weeks. I wasn't very clear about that, but both the P100 and the N170 lasted for 4 weeks.
Oh, yes. I wanted to ask if there are imaging studies of dyslexia in Chinese, and how do we talk about universals, so how does that compare?
Yes, good point. There are studies, and they tend to find the following, that whereas in alphabetic reading one finds lower levels of activation in areas associated with phonology in the left hemisphere. In Chinese, the main finding is left middle frontal gyrus underactivated. There have also been studies, been anatomical studies, and Chinese dyslexics show smaller volume in the area of the left middle frontal gyrus. All this is consistent with the conclusion that that piece of anatomy is important in reading Chinese. Someone once asked me, what does that piece of anatomy do when it's not reading Chinese? It's a very good question. You ought to always ask this question when someone tells you about a brain area that seems to have something special. God did not put that area there in order for it to read Chinese. But there's something about the Chinese writing system that places demands on this prefrontal area. And it could be, as I was suggesting, something to do with selecting, when you see a character, selecting the connection that you need, perhaps suppressing the phonology, which we have evidence gets activated automatically, because if that phonology stays active, it could lead you to the wrong meaning. So it's not completely clear, but it is important to know that it does occur in a lot of tasks in other reading Chinese. You can find it in a variety of decision and memory tasks that involve decisions.
You said earlier that writing systems, not language and not meaning. Could you explain this?
Well, it's just that the connection is to the linguistic system. So think of the linguistic system as its various levels, phonology, and within phonology, phonemes and syllables, morphemes, which have grammatical status as well as meaning. It's not that we obviously we get meaning out of language. It's just that all of the writing systems of the world are now fairly abstract. The idea, when people started writing, it was natural to make the graphs stand for things in the world. That turned out to be great until you wanted to make more messages than you had symbols for. So those systems are not productive. All the systems, Chinese, even Chinese to some extent, have become productive. The language is productive, right? We make all the words in our language out of a handful of phonemes, whatever they are in our language. And we make all the grammatical sentences in our language out of a handful, out of thousands of morphemes that we have in the language. So what you want in a writing system, what you want in the evolutionary system, is to get the writing system to mimic that productivity. So the writing system becomes productive, so you can use a finite set of elements over and over again to have meaning, so that you get to the end. So that's the way that they've evolved. They've evolved away from being graphs that stand for something in the world to graphs that stand for something in language.
We have two systems of writing. One system you read and one system you write. It's different in Hebrew. I think in English too. There's a script. The script. Yeah. So in Chinese there's only one, right?
Yeah, well, there are two scripts depending on where you live. I mean, the Chinese is written in traditional scripts. It's simplified, and it is interesting that the traditional one, which is more complex, is actually considered easier for reading because it has more distinctive features. Again, think of the idea: if your system is not complex, two symbols seem more similar, but when they get complex, they got a lot of ways to be different. Writing is the opposite. People would much rather write simplified because it's a lot easier to write. But in the Hebrew case, you're pointing attention to the difference between formal, what you would get in formal reading,
In
and what
books,
you books, yeah.
Cursive.
The cursive. Yeah, it's interesting that most of the studies of reading have been with print, but cursive, there's an interesting study within the last 6 months in French showing handwriting, recognition of handwriting effects and involvement of motor cortex in that. When I first did the Chinese work on writing, there wasn't much in any other language. A little bit in English for development, but it was mainly about making letters. And I thought that writing would be especially useful for Chinese because of the contrast in the orthography with English or Hebrew. But I think it's pretty clear that writing in any, I think it's likely, I shouldn't say pretty, I think it's likely that writing in any orthography is good for recognition. The French study did not show that it was somehow better. What it showed was that if you recognized cursive writing, there was activation in motor areas that wasn't there when you recognized print. So yeah, the brain does get involved in things in ways that accord with its experience. When you have experience writing, you are elaborating that part of the network.
Is that?
So Laura,
Well,
gets the
just
last
as a
question.
follow-up on this, do you think it has to be a script you're less familiar with, or do you think you'll get the benefit of the writing even for scripts or letters that you're an expert in?
Yeah, that's a good question. My entering assumption was especially good for ones you're not familiar with. I will add a piece of data. We found in a study with real classroom learners in Chinese, recently a behavioral study we carried out this last fall, that we tried to test novices that were within the first week of the start of class. And what we found was during the first term, writing instruction, this writing practice of the type I talked about, did not help their reading compared with other techniques like chunking, where we highlight a piece of the character. In the second year, we found the writing effects. So I wanted to revise that. I think the writing helps if you're familiar with the forms. If you're like a complete baby at it, it adds a task. Concentrate so much on the writing, maybe you're not even visually attending. But if you're sort of familiar with the general structure and the form, which happens pretty rapidly, then I think the writing would help. That may turn out to be the right answer for when to introduce writing. Maybe not from the very first.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.